Ransomware attack on the Colonial Pipeline. On May 7, 2021, the United States faced one of the most disruptive cyber attacks to ever hit. A ransomware attack targeting the Colonial Pipeline. This single incident shut down 5,500 miles of pipeline, which normally supplies nearly half of the East Coast fuel. It wasn't just about the gas. No. The shutdown impacted jet fuel, diesel, home heating, and transportation. This triggering much panic buying and economic disruption. The group behind the attack, known as DarkSide, was able to halt 2.5 million barrels of fuel, all from behind a computer screen, and all because of a compromised password. This slide kicks into what we are diving into today: how a cybercrime like this exposed major vulnerabilities in our infrastructure, and why it changed the conversation around cybersecurity in the United States for good.
The primary decision maker in the Colonial Pipeline hacking incident was Joseph Blount, the CEO of Colonial Pipeline. The decision that Joseph Blount, the CEO of Colonial Pipeline, had to make was whether to comply with the cyber criminals' demands and pay a ransom to regain control of the company, Colonial Pipeline. Ultimately, and against the FBI's advice, Blount paid the demanded $4.4 million ransom. Blount believed that paying the ransom was the correct decision to make to decrease the potential for additional harm to the United States. The decision maker's key objective was to restore control of the Colonial Pipeline services, repair the damage, and halt the disruptions the attack caused, ensuring that an event like this would never occur again. Colonial Pipeline is responsible for roughly 45% of the East Coast's fuel supply, establishing its prominence as a critical service provider for the United States citizens. The attack damaged the supply chain, affecting costs in multiple states and inciting fuel shortages across the region. For example, roughly 63% of gas stations in North Carolina were completely out of fuel, and in some states, gas prices amounted to over $3 per gallon. This event caused the company to cease operations for 5 days until the issue was resolved. The team at Colonial Pipeline also sought to patch vulnerabilities that would prevent this event from occurring again. More specifically, they sought to eliminate VPN weaknesses and ensure further security measures were installed, like multi-factor authentication. Although Blount was the chief decision maker as the CEO of the Colonial Pipeline, there were others involved in the incident. Other decision makers included the United States Department of Justice. They were factored in as a decision maker in their ability to seize $2.3 million from the ransom payment. Furthermore, other government agencies like the Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency and the Federal Bureau of Investigation had some decision-making capacity throughout the incident as well. CISA provided cybersecurity advice in infrastructure protection and provided expertise in follow-up legislation following the incident, which was designed to establish proactive guardrails that would prevent future incidents of the same caliber. The FBI provided investigative services throughout and post-incident, ensuring that the cyber criminals could be identified. On the opposite side of the incident was the DarkSide group. They were responsible for hacking Colonial Pipeline. DarkSide creates ransomware and other malicious software, selling it to other hacker groups and cyber criminals through the internet. The group's goal in the Colonial Pipeline hack was financial extortion of a wealthy United States-based company, not sabotage of cyberspace infrastructure. The group attempts to portray itself as a professional organization with a code of ethics and asserts that a portion of the money they steal is donated to charities. The group appears only to attack English-speaking countries and avoids former Soviet nations. It is believed that DarkSide is Russian-based. This incident spurred a complex and tense environment within the United States. Not only were the fuel and power shortages causing concern, but the technological vulnerability caused cybersecurity concerns across government and private organizations. Furthermore, it established policy and social concerns amongst government officials and the public. This arose from the inability to keep a critical piece of American infrastructure safe and operable. There were several constraints affecting the response to the Colonial Pipeline incident. First, analyzing the vulnerability that led to the hack was challenging for the company personnel to identify. Initially, VPN logs and other security procedures did not identify the nature of the hack, since there was no way for those procedures to trace the activity. Furthermore, decision makers at Colonial Pipeline had to manage the operational pressure of the situation, since the company was responsible for a significant portion of the United States' fuel distribution. Additionally, U.S. federal agencies were unable to neutralize dark side cyber infrastructure, making it difficult to limit their progress. Further constraints included the potential for prolonged outage of the Colonial Pipeline operations, public outcry and disdain, and future cybersecurity implications. Prolonged outage would cause fuel prices to rise and ensure that fewer fuel stations across the country would have gasoline to distribute. The following public disdain would negatively affect the image of the Colonial Pipeline, as well as the responding federal agencies. Finally, the lasting cybersecurity implications represented a fear in the United States that rogue or individual hackers and groups could significantly interfere with the operations of critical infrastructure within the country, both in the private and public sectors. This incident motivated Colonial Pipeline and U.S. government employees working on the case to fast-track a solution and seek or utilize new technological and policy opportunities. Through this effort, they were able to identify. This incident spurred a complex and tense environment within the United States. Not only were the fuel and power shortages causing concern, but the technological vulnerability caused cybersecurity concerns across government and private organizations. Furthermore, it established policy and social concerns amongst government officials and the public. This arose from the inability to keep a critical piece of American infrastructure safe and operable. There were several constraints affecting the response to the Colonial Pipeline incident. First, analyzing the vulnerability that led to the hack was challenging for the company personnel to identify. Initially, VPN logs and other security procedures did not identify the nature of the hack, since there was no way for those procedures to trace the activity. Furthermore, decision makers at Colonial Pipeline had to manage the operational pressure of the situation, since the company was responsible for a significant portion of the United States' fuel distribution. Additionally, U.S. federal agencies were unable to neutralize dark side cyber infrastructure, making it difficult to limit their progress. Further constraints included the potential for prolonged outage of the Colonial Pipeline operations, public outcry and disdain, and future cybersecurity implications. Prolonged outage would cause fuel prices to rise and ensure that fewer fuel stations across the country would have gasoline to distribute. The following public disdain would negatively affect the image of the Colonial Pipeline, as well as the responding federal agencies. Finally, the lasting cybersecurity implications represented a fear in the United States that rogue or individual hackers and groups could significantly interfere with the operations of critical infrastructure within the country, both in the private and public sectors. This incident motivated Colonial Pipeline and U.S. government employees working on the case to fast-track a solution and seek or utilize new technological and policy opportunities. Through this effort, they were able to identify the breach as having been executed through an unused VPN account without multi-factor authentication on the dark web. This allowed officials to locate where the dark side group breached Colonial Pipeline security measures. The Colonial Pipeline team identified the opportunity to search for new VPN services that would eliminate the issue that caused the hack initially. The Colonial Pipeline team also took advantage of the situation to install new network alarms into their programs. These alarms, combined with new VPN services, add an additional layer of protection against future hacks. The U.S. agencies that aided Colonial Pipeline responded that was also an opportunity to be used. The partnership with the Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency was a unique opportunity that leveraged cybersecurity advising and aid to Colonial Pipeline, while the FBI elements led the investigative efforts. The varied response agencies established an effective relationship with Colonial Pipeline, which was utilized to effectively respond to the hack and determine post-incident initiatives.
Analysis of the issue. So let's talk about it. Let's talk about how something as simple as a password basically jeopardized critical infrastructure in the United States. The Colonial Pipeline breach happened because of one compromised password. Just one. And to make matters worse, the account didn't even have MFA, multi-factor authentication. Multi-factor authentication is the multiple steps that sometimes we do, even to sign into social media, things like Instagram, where you are proving that it's actually you, that you're proving that you're actually allowed to access this content. This alone displayed just how outdated and unprotected the system for the Colonial Pipeline truly was. There was no clear response plan, no backup, and no real cyber resilience in place. And because of the lack of preparation, the Colonial Pipeline had to shut everything down. Not because they were hacked directly, but because they just did not know how far the breach had gone. This uncertainty shut down nearly half of the East Coast fuel supply for almost a week and a half. This incident pulled the curtain back on how fragile our critical infrastructure really is. The systems running these operations were outdated, with little to no cybersecurity strategy. One weak link and it all unraveled. So when we're talking about cyber vulnerabilities, this is what we mean. No MFA, no real contingency plan in place, and a complete exposure of just how behind we are when it comes to protecting critical infrastructures and what matters the most.
The next piece that we're going to be looking at is the assessment of decision makers' leadership. The first point would be how the leadership panicked due to the company's lack of mitigation and response strategies in place for a cyber attack. So that being said, there were several significant issues in 2021 with the Colonial Pipeline ransom attack with the leadership. The Colonial Pipeline lacked any mitigation and response strategies for cyber attack on its networks, meaning that they were not prepared for this kind of attacks. The primary issue was the infiltration of the Colonial Pipeline's cybersecurity network through a single compromised password. Somehow, Darkware Ransom Group was able to get a password from one of the employees. From there, they were able to infiltrate the Colonial Pipeline's cyber network. The cybersecurity infrastructure of the Colonial Pipeline did not have a multi-factor authentication for its employees and with their passwords in place at this point in time. Basically, when they sign into a computer at their job, or if you work for any sort of job, especially for the government, you'll get either a text message or an email with a code that constantly changes. This one-time code will then get you onto the network along with your password. As this code constantly changes, it keeps getting re-upped in an authenticated factor such as an RSA. This makes it a lot more harder for any type of cyber criminals to hack the network. There were no other steps in place for these codes. Although they were operating a network, had not been infiltrated prior, and they did not have any issues in the past. Colonial Pipeline officials feared that this ransom attack could spread to other critical operations. So panic started to set in within their leadership. What did they decide to do? They decided to shut down the entire pipeline system to mitigate the risk of ransom affecting their operations. That was one issue. Another issue of the decision-making of leadership's ability was the spread of the ransomware. The pipeline feared that the ransomware was going to spread into the operations technology network that compromised the IT network, and it will critically take down their operations. So they decided to shut down the entire pipeline in May of 2021 for several days. That caused widespread mass pandemonium in many southeast states, especially North Carolina, where fuel supplies were severely interrupted. This caused increased gas lines, panic buying from consumers who feared they would not be able to get gas again. And it also rose the price of gasoline, causing economic hardship to these consumers. Another issue is the Colonial Pipeline had to figure out if they were going to pay the ransom to the hacking group. So this led to financial losses for the Colonial Pipeline and increased their vulnerability for future cyber attacks. Since they made the payment public, it looks like it would encourage other groups to do this for potential of lucrative financial gains, not just to them, but to other critical infrastructure companies run by both private and public institutions, where they could try to hack their systems and demand a sense of some sort of financial reward. The next step we're talking about in the PowerPoint would be recommendations. Recommendations. The Critical Infrastructure, Protection, Risk Management, and Resilient book explains how the Department of Homeland Security developed the THERA process. THERA stands for Threat, Hazard, Identification, and Risk Assessment. This is a comprehensive approach to identifying risks and their associated impacts. The THERA process uses 4 steps to identify these threats. This includes identify the threats and hazards of concerns, provide context for threats and hazards, establish capability targets, and then apply the results. The THERA process will provide recommendations for the federal government, the Colonial Pipeline, and other agencies responsible for managing critical infrastructure to enhance their cyber security network. Another recommendation is to identify weaknesses in the Colonial Pipeline's operational network and employ and improve their employee training. This training is imperative to enhance employees' knowledge of proper cybersecurity measures. They need to identify and be trained on and implement 2-step authentication process for their passwords. It is imperative for these employees to understand what a phishing scam is and what a password account attempt hacking is. These failures can be detrimental to the company, for the Colonial Pipeline, and other critical infrastructures if proper cybersecurity is not followed by their employees and also by management. An additional recommendation is for the federal government to have open lines of communication to all private and public critical infrastructure entities. What this means, open lines of communication, is to have the federal government be able to assist any sort of a critical infrastructure company both day and night. Example, power companies, water companies, they work all night. If they experience a cyber attack or some kind of breach in their cybersecurity, they will be able to reach the federal government, the proper avenue, whether it's criminal, FBI, or CISA, and from there they could try to have the state police help out or any kind of local federal task force, including Homeland Security. This is to mitigate any potential disruptions in any kind of critical services that people rely on every single day. The communication lines could be simple as a phone number, an email, or some sort of voice activation to the proper authorities. But there has to be a communication also with the federal government being able to communicate with a critical infrastructure company, especially if it's private, to have the proper phone number in case the federal government gets intelligence that they find out there might be some sort of security breach for this critical infrastructure, whether it's public or private. This would to ensure open lines and two-way communications with both public and private institutions. It's imperative that this stays and remains open. Former President Biden and his administration implemented this in 2021 with CISA, and they have the private critical infrastructures and the public ones being able to communicate directly with the government in case something like this occurs again, which is crucial. The last recommendation is to advise the Colonial Pipeline and other critical infrastructure entities not to pay any type of ransoms to any type of criminal organizations, whether individual or a organized group. This will just embolden the criminal element to continue to attempt to do a hack, as we learned in the Colonial Pipeline case, where this is a mere case of financial gain. They had no interest in disrupting services except for getting paid. That was their ultimate outcome. It wasn't political. It wasn't terrorism. It was all about money. And the fear is, if you pay one group, and even if they get away with some sort of money, did the pros outweigh the cons? And if that's the case, there will be copycats, and it will continue and have other cyber attack groups continuously wreaking havoc in our critical infrastructures. This will cause severe disruptions and will be not good for the United States of America and everyone's daily lives. So they need to make sure they do not pay any sort of ransom unless it's a controlled one the federal government is using to track the cyber group, to follow them and bring them to justice.
The 2021 Colonial Pipeline ransomware attack wasn't just one of the largest cyber attacks in United States history. It was a wake-up call for the United States. It showed to us that cybersecurity is not just a technology issue. It's also a public safety concern. The fact that this all started from a single compromised password, that one-week link triggered fuel shortages across nearly half the East Coast, causing panic buying, long lines, and real economic impact. The ransomware attack exposed major gaps in how our critical infrastructure is protected. The systems that we rely on every day were still outdated and unprepared in 2021. This incident pushed much needed action. It encouraged both government and private sectors to step up to the plate to strengthen cybersecurity as a whole, create new policies, and actually respond to the reality that digital threats have real-world consequences. In the end, this was not just about the 2021 Colonial Pipeline. It was about how vulnerable we all are when cybersecurity isn't taken seriously in this day and age where cyber domain is what's taking over our everyday lives.